everyone, and welcome to the Forward Thinking Podcast. It's Chrissy here from CS2, and today I have two special guests, which I'm really excited about. I have the co-host of the RevOps podcast, and it's Brandon Redlinger and Jordan Henderson from Revenue.io. Jordan is the Senior Director of RevOps and is the host of the show, and Brandon is the Senior Director of Product Marketing at Revenue.io. So I'm really excited to have them on, and we're actually going to be talking about the operations around podcasts, like creating a podcast, what it's like, how you can do that at your company. And I get this question a lot, and I'm assuming maybe Jordan and Brandon get it too, maybe Brandon more, but like people will always ask me, how did you get your podcast off the ground? Like, what do you do? And I think that I can talk to it from an agency side, but I thought it'd be an awesome topic for these two, because they could really apply it to how do people do that in their everyday job? Like, how does a tech company do that? So welcome both of you.
Thanks for having us. Brandon, I want to point out she did correctly say that I am the host of the podcast. Just want
I was about to say, how much did you have to pay her for that?
It was very well researched here.
Co-host.
That is actually 100% accurate. Brandon is a frequent guest. Let's put it at that.
A frequent guest on every podcast.
Oh yeah, sorry. And actually, you know what is so funny about that? Before this, I was like, make sure you say co-host.
No, this is an ongoing joke for us. I have called it out 40 times. I am the host of the podcast. I ask all the questions. I do everything. Brandon
does the legwork.
I write the agendas, do everything. Brandon shows up. So no, he doesn't get co-host credit. He gets featured performer credit at best.
Featured performer.
Yeah, you're like the like DJ that's like, featuring whatever, but I'm Jordan's like the main star.
Yeah, I'm Fallon and he's the Roots.
No, I'm just
I don't know. I don't know about that. We'll see.
But then the person that actually gets most of that credit and the royalties is probably the DJ. So there you go. Okay, cool. Well, I want to kick it off. I ask this a lot of our guests, is more like how you got into operations. But I know for both of you have different backgrounds, one in operations, one on the marketing side and product marketing. But maybe I'll start with you, Brandon. We'll go to Jordan. But how did you get into the space of B2B tech?
Yeah, good question. So I probably a slightly different background, or maybe, who knows, maybe this is pretty common, but right out of college, I actually started my own business. I was doing health and wellness coaching. I was a certified personal trainer, certified health coach, nutritionist, the whole 9 yards. What they don't teach you in school is actually how to build a business. And I thought, get your certifications, hang your shingle up, and clients will come pounding down your door. Not quite the case, except, far from it, actually. So I actually dove into the business side, ended up loving it, got so many clients. I started, a lot of my colleagues started asking me, how'd you build your business? So I ended up teaching them how to build their business, and then did more of that than actually health coaching. And then one of the school that I went to, the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, got wind of what I was doing. They said, hey, you should come work here. And I was like, yeah, that sounds good. They're like, but we want you to do sales. And I was like, okay, maybe that's my foot in the door. I'll do sales. So I did that for 2 years. Ended up loving it, actually. And then after that, I was like, I still really want to figure out the marketing side of businesses. So I made the transition over to marketing, ended up loving that too. Not sure if I'll ever go back to building my own business one day, because I do love sales and marketing, but that's actually how I ended up in marketing.
Yeah, well, I feel like when you run a business, you're doing sales and marketing and HR and, all of that at the beginning, at 100%. Least. But do you miss any of your health coaching? Like, that seems really interesting. Do you miss any of that? Or do you feel like you do enough of it with just yourself and your family?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I still keep up with it, but yeah, not as hardcore as I used to be. Still go to the gym, 6 times a week, still pretty healthy, doing the Whole30 diet right now with my wife, but not actually consulting anymore.
Cool. All right. Well, what about you, Jordan?
Yeah. So I prior to tech, I have a legal background, so I'm actually still a licensed attorney. I graduated law school and is working in that field for a couple of years. Frankly, I got really bored very fast, and so I had moved to LA and 10 years ago or so. I was working at a firm just across the street from a software company, and I knew most people at that software company by way of having lunch with them pretty consistently, and they kind of kept convincing me to
Mm.
come join their software company, not as a GC or a lawyer ultimately, but I joined as what they call the community organizer, which is one of those like software companies inventing titles that really mean nothing. You're just an SDR sort of thing. Like everybody there at some point's title was community organizer, like top to bottom, which is just ridiculous. But the
Hmm.
so I actually took that job which was essentially an SDR job. I was making like 60 cold calls. Had some small version of a customer base to work. And just work my way up from there. So I've done SDR job, I've done the CSM job, I've done AE, I've been a closer, I've managed sales teams, I've managed CS teams, SDR teams, marketing teams, kind of across the board over the past 10 years. Realized a long time ago that I didn't want to directly, be the VP of sales or be the VP of CS, that sort of thing. I liked the operations component of running those teams better. But having had the experience
Mm.
of actually running those teams day to day helps me better, manage operations as a whole because I understand the value of the things we're doing and integrating those teams together. And so I've been doing revenue operations for going on probably 6-7 years. Since before it was a
Hmm.
title, I guess. At one point my title was
Yeah.
the senior director of sales development, sales, and customer success operations, which was I think like the
Quite a mouthful.
yeah, it was if you go it's still on my LinkedIn, it like literally goes to the next line. Uh,
Yeah.
and so yeah, and that was like essentially pre-revenue operations title. And with that job, I was also managing the marketing team, so it was revenue operations. We just didn't know what to call it
Oh,
yet. And so yeah,
yeah.
so it's been an interesting journey for sure.
I think it's interesting. Both of you have been in sales roles before, which probably is really helpful now that you are working at revenue.io. I mean, you guys are building a tool to help salespeople, and you have, a podcast that's geared toward RevOps people. But I think, a lot of RevOps is supporting, people in the sales function or customer success. And um, I, I hear that a lot. So I had Sean Lane on the podcast. His isn't out yet, but he has a very similar story where he started out in SD, like running SDR team, SDR, and now he's the VP of field operations there. But he was saying that he has a lot more empathy as like in his role because he understands like how
Mhm.
hard that job is, what they need to be successful. And but just decided it wasn't the sales part he wanted to do. He really wanted to enable
Totally.
those
Yeah. I mean,
teams.
it is. I think it's super helpful just to have done as many jobs as you can, especially if you're in operations in general.
Yeah.
You should have at least some real world experience doing the thing you're running operations for, so you can understand the value. Right. That's the most important thing.
Totally. Cool. Well, I know we're on today to talk about the podcast, so I want to kind of dive right into it because I feel like there's a lot that we're
Yeah.
going to be covering. But I first want to talk about just the podcast itself. Like, how did the podcast, the RevOps podcast, like come to be, and whose idea
It
was
was
it?
mine. This will be like the one question I get to firmly answer today because Brandon did a bunch of the legwork on this thing. I'll grant that. This is the one time I'll give him credit for anything. Uh,
Yeah, appreciate that.
but
Finally getting the
the
credit I
idea was
deserve.
so to say it was mine is maybe a bit of a misnomer. Alec who produces it, and I have been working together sort of like on the company's social media thing on my social media over the past couple of years. About 6 months into that, we were like sort of talking about podcasts that both of us listened to and messaging those back and forth to each other. And we sort of jokingly, I said, "Oh, we should start a RevOps podcast called Scotch and Ops, where we sit and like drink scotch and talk
Mm.
about ops." Turns out that podcast already exists. They've only done like 2 episodes, but it already exists. Scotch
Oh, it's
Oh,
hops and ops or
Hops
something
and
like
Ops,
that.
that's what it was. And I was like,
oh,
"Ah,
hops
damn!"
and
Like,
ups. Okay, that
yeah,
makes
They don't even
sense.
spell hops correctly,
yeah, I know.
It's like
It was very disappointing. They've only done a couple episodes, and I was like, yeah, but they already like grabbed
they
that
stole
name,
it.
and so it's gone
Yeah.
forever. But so then it sort of like was a joking throwaway thing, And then it progressed into, no, we should actually probably do this, like see how it goes. And then that was
Yeah.
probably a few months before Brandon joined Revenue IO. We'd been talking
Mm.
about it, sort of figuring out what it looked like. Brandon joined, and we decided to just sort of go for it at that point. We recorded the first episode. It actually was the first episode we ever recorded. There was essentially no edits done, and we were like, "Oh, this is great. Let's just do it." And it's been running since then. And there's we'll talk about it, a million things that happened between recording an episode and getting a podcast
Yeah.
live, but yeah, it was a throwaway joke.
I have a question for Yeah. I have a question because you mentioned that you were working on your LinkedIn with like your co-producer or your producer. What does that mean? Like, did you go out with the intention to like really spread some of your knowledge around RevOps? Was that something you did yourself, or was that something that you thought like with your like marketing team, oh, this would be a good thing for us to do to boost our
Yeah,
brand?
no, that's a
How
good
did that come
question.
about?
Alec pestered me to do it for probably about a year. He would probably say it was longer than that, but it was about a year. Mostly because one of the things we talked about, we ended up doing after like 6 months of him talking to me, we had an hour session where I wanted to understand the why. Like, why do you want me to be more active on LinkedIn? Why do you want me to focus on doing this? And we sort of walked away from
Yeah.
that with, like there's a demand gen component. Let's be honest, like of course there's a demand gen component to it, right? Like we want to, it's good for branding for the company, it's good for lead generation, it's good for everything for the business. But the whole, like the number one rule we live by is I won't post things if I don't think it actually adds value. So the main goal of it is
Yeah.
to actually just like provide insights to the world and do that sort of stuff. And I actually get people message me that all the time, like, hey, why do you use LinkedIn so much? Like, I just like wanted to share some stuff that I thought would be helpful. That's legitimately it. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's been a
I
good
like,
balance of that,
yeah.
I think. Actually focusing on that.
Yeah. I think that I take that approach with LinkedIn. It's hard because like I try not to like fall into this gap of like conforming into like what the
Yeah,
algorithm likes. I'm
Right.
just like, I just want to put some good content out there. The right people will see it, or the right people who want to hear it will action it. And so I think providing value is a good thing. Like it needs to be that. It can't just be like, oh, hey guys, we're going to start posting on LinkedIn
totally.
and whatever, just do whatever you want, post a meme and whatever. I mean, some people
Yeah,
do that and that's great. I love that kind of stuff. But
yeah,
providing value, I think, especially when you're tied to a
totally.
brand
I mean,
is great.
it's I always
Um,
sort of ask myself, like, would I follow me if I posted that? And because I don't, there's not a lot of people who I do, really engage with when I follow. So if I meet that threshold, then I'm happy.
that's good. Yeah. And then Brandon, so you came on like right as like it was in its infancy, but had you done a podcast at any of your past companies, like, or have you like helped produce one or come up with
Yeah, so
content for
actually,
one? Or
I did do a podcast. I done two before. Um,
oh
yeah,
wow, okay,
back I don't know 6 years ago, back when Data Nyes was around. The co-founder of Data Nyes had a podcast. Him and I had a podcast. It really took off. I had so much fun doing it, and then I had actually just launched a podcast at Demand Base around ABM before I. So we were maybe 12 episodes into that when I left and then joined.
Nice.
Um,
okay. I think I remember some of your videos from
totally.
it, but that's maybe that's what. Yeah, a lot of the videos that
Were
you
you
share
were
on
you hosting
LinkedIn,
either of
those
these
are great.
podcasts?
I was. What? Why are you so
I
surprised?
just I was
Wait,
I was,
who's a
I was
host?
well, it sounded like the founder was hosting the first one. I'm guessing John Miller was hosting the demand based one.
Actually, no, it wasn't.
Oh, you were
No,
proper
Yeah.
Brandon
hosting it. Oh,
was.
I was
Brandon
really
was.
expecting the like
Yeah.
always a bridesmaid, never a bride situation.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. No, but yeah. So I had experience with launching a few podcasts before. I wanted to do another one, and honestly, when Alec, our producer, was like, "You should do the RevOps podcast," I was a little hesitant. I
Yeah.
was like, well, that's really Jordan's strength. That's his forte. Jordan and Jonathan, the other co-host, who really is there just to nod his head, you know.
You're not wrong.
Yeah.
He adds really good, helpful insights twice an episode.
three
Really,
episodes,
really
exactly.
helpful.
And I was like, okay, fine, I'll just do it. We'll see how it works out. I thought that it would be me joining the first few episodes and then I'd slowly fade away. But it turns out, one, I do actually have pretty strong opinions about revenue operations. Two, I was having a lot of fun doing it. And three, actually learning a lot while I was doing it. So
Yeah.
I was like, we might have something here. And before you know it, our podcast actually picked up pretty quickly. Now we're getting thousands of downloads per episode. And I don't think there's any turning back now.
That's awesome. Yeah. One great thing about the podcast, like you said, the learning piece is that's what I like about it. It was like, one, you're able to crystallize your own opinions and thoughts on it. It's also why I like
Mhm.
LinkedIn posting, because it kind
Yes,
of forces you to do
100%.
that. But also hearing from people, especially like, it forces you to have these like kind of mentor conversations that you don't normally have, but like it's kind of,
Hmm.
you're hearing what someone's doing, you're able to empathize with them, but you're also learning something new, but in a really fun way, and like also understanding the person behind it. So I agree with you. It just, and I think that RevOps, like you said, you're like, well, I don't know much about RevOps, but if you're in marketing or if you had any marketing role, like RevOps is really just enabling like the growth of the company. So you're really also just, they're enabling you. So like you can't do one without the other. You need the strategy, you need the enablement
Yeah,
of that. Like they're one in one. So I think from your perspective, you provide a lot of great perspective, I think, to a RevOps person, of like articulating the needs of what the business,
totally. One of
needs.
the things we ask on sort of every topic is, like, why is this important to you? And Brandon being on the
Hmm.
podcast is actually the reason why we asked that question, because basically one of the things I wanted to show is if, even if you don't know anything about RevOps, if you're on the marketing team, CS team, sales team, whatever that looks like, you have a vested interest in so many of the things that RevOps is doing on a daily basis, right? And if I went to you at any
Hmm.
time and said like, hey, why do you have a vested, or why do you have an interest in marketing attribution? You know the 7 reasons why you have an interest in marketing attribution, but you don't, like, you would say, I don't know anything about RevOps. We're working on that. And that was sort of why I wanted to, which we got one review. I'll just put this out there. We got one review that were like, I'm not sure why there's a product marketer on this podcast, but he adds value. and Brandon
After I read that review, I was like, all right.
has clinged to that review
Yeah,
for,
exactly.
for
I never
months.
let that one go.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as the let's talk about a little bit about the development of the podcast. So when I think of a podcast development, at least for ourselves, like, I mean, normally it starts with a guest, but sometimes we don't
Hmm.
have guests, and but we usually think about, okay, what is our topic going to be? What are the questions we're going to ask? Like, how did you guys come up with that? Like, what was did you know, or do you have an idea of like who you wanted on the podcast? How did you do that outreach? Like, how did you plan out your content, at least for the first few episodes?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we wanted to do something that was a little bit different than everyone else out there, right? A lot of podcasts really revolve around the guests, which is great, right?
Hmm.
But we wanted to set out to do something different. So instead of really making it all about the guests, it was honestly all about revenue operations, but more specifically how
Yeah.
we can add value to the day-to-day practitioners, right? It's not high level, it's not fluff, it's actual really deep in the weed stuff. And we are pretty active on LinkedIn because we want to know, what are people talking about out there? What are people wondering? What are the questions around revenue operations? We're in Slack communities like Pavilion or Wizard of Ops, and we're always looking at what are the conversations that people are having, and then how can we actually
Mm.
add to that conversation. And I think that's really why it's done really well. And we have actually started to introduce guests every maybe 5-6 episodes, and it turns out that those episodes are actually doing pretty well, so we might do more guests. But that was a thing we knew from the beginning, was we're going to start off with this format. We'll see how it goes. We can test, we can iterate, right? We can measure how things are going with limited tool set. It's not like marketing attribution where you have, where you're tracking all your listens across platforms and everything like that. Hopefully we get there someday, but we're always learning and always evolving the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Jordan, are you the one that kind of comes up with that like tangible advice for the
Yeah,
RevOps
yeah, for
folks?
sure. I mean, Brandon and Jonathan have each sort of picked one topic. That's like let's and so but for the to like the format thing, yeah, the tangible advice, all that stuff. And Brandon and Jonathan actually bring a ton of value in that regard, to be honest. Usually what I'll do is when we're talking about a topic, I'll write down in advance, here's the 3 or 4 things that I think we want to leave listeners with, like the value that I want them to leave the conversation with. Because the whole goal of the thing is that somebody
Okay.
leaves it with 4 action items, right? That they can actually follow up on. What I've actually found, which is really interesting, is usually they leave with 5 or 6, and that's because Brandon and Jonathan add 1 or 2 in that I hadn't thought of, which is really really important. And the reason this is, I used to do like a bunch of podcasts as a guest, and I still do. Like, obviously, I'm a
Yeah.
guest on your podcast, and I used to do like I still do a ton of speaking engagements, and I often leave them very frustrated. And not that I'll leave this very frustrated, but because they say they invite me on to talk about marketing attribution or lead routing. We spent, and I have 40 minutes.
Yeah.
We spend the first 20 minutes of a panel, talking about how we got into RevOps, talking about my background, like blah blah blah. And then you get 20 minutes to talk about the topic, and I don't feel like guests get that deep dive that I really want to get to. And I know it's still probably still super helpful, but I want to get way deeper into this, and that's because I'm a nerd, and that's what happens. And so I would always be like, God, I really wish I could have got to these 3 things that are further down that rabbit hole. And so the format of just having the same 3 hosts was actually pretty intentional to make sure that we could sort of circumvent everything and just be like, great, 2 minutes in the podcast, let's start talking about this topic. We're gonna have 40 minutes to just hammer this topic, and then we can get to everything that we want to get to.
Yeah.
Which I think it makes it, sometimes a bit of a niche thing. Like some people start turning on an episode, they're like, I don't want to listen to 38 minutes of this. Like, oh my God, I'm sure.
38 minutes of attribution.
Yeah.
And they fall
But
asleep.
it gives
Right.
us the chance to make sure we really kick the tires, because most of these things we can't really talk about in 20 minutes. We just can't.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a series called like Mops in 10, and it's so tough
Yeah.
like we to give people, but I do think that people are
Yeah.
short on time, so like we wanted to mix it up. Okay, if you're gonna, we basically take one of our longer podcasts, it's kind of what you guys do. You go deep into something, but okay, let's just really, it's like your 4 key things that you wanted to take from that. We basically turn that now into some of our Mops in 10 episodes. So like if someone is
Yeah.
too busy, they're like, okay, at least I just know the things I
Yeah,
need to
that's
do.
brilliant.
But I think
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
That's a brilliant idea. Yeah.
But I like both. I think you're saying, oh, 38 minutes on attributions, Northfest. But for me, I'm like, no, that's amazing.
Exactly, totally.
Right. Like when we go through
I
like
want
7
to-
different potential attribution models and why they might fit or why they might not fit. And you cannot do that in 15 minutes. You just can't.
Yeah.
Right? Like it is
No.
a dense topic. We could have probably done 2 hours on
Yeah.
that.
Easily.
Like,
Easily.
yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And even breaking down the issues with like attribution, I
Right.
could do 2 hours
Yeah.
or positives, So, okay. So then creating the content, it's kind of like Jordan provides insights, but then, it's a team effort, it seems like, as far as like where you're going to source those ideas and also
Yep.
your guests. Then what does the production look like? And like, what did that process look like? Like, how did you figure out what platform to use? And, what was your process? Do you record every day at the same time? Maybe Brandon, you
Yeah.
start.
So I think we cheat a little bit because we actually have another podcast that they've been doing for about 6 years. Revenue.io acquired the podcast about a year. Actually, at this
okay.
point, almost
2
2 years ago.
Yeah.
2 years ago, called the Sales Enablement Podcast with Andy Paul, and they have it down really well over there, right? So our producer knows exactly what it takes to launch a podcast, how to actually produce all the episodes. He has his editor, he has his entire process from front to back. So a lot of it for us, Jordan, Jonathan, we just kind of show up, do the episode. We use Riverside like you do. And then he kind of takes care of the rest. Now, I will say I do have a lot of friends in podcasting. The people over at Sweetfish Media, I'm pretty close with them. So we talk about podcasting all the time. So if there is a new tool, if there is a new technique, if there is something else that I want to try, we can easily do that. But again, starting from scratch is going to be harder than actually having someone who knows what they're doing. So kind of cheating.
Yeah. And then Jordan, I mean, for both of you, but Brandon's on the marketing side, so he's like, I love this. This is marketing content. But for you, you also have your day job of supporting your internal customers. So how do you kind of set aside that time of during your week to really say, okay, this is worth my time, and that includes LinkedIn and podcasting. Like, what do you have, like a specific like percentage of your time that you do per week, and then the rest can go towards your
Yeah,
normal day
it's a
job?
very small percentage to this. Let's be honest. I have 15 minutes set aside every morning. So I start my morning 15 minutes catching up on Slack, 15 minutes catching up on email, 15 minutes catching up on LinkedIn, and sending out a LinkedIn post. Most days I don't post every day, but when I do, and then I check it once or twice a day with the 5 minute check in reminder. My calendar is very regimented because I have a lot of teams.
Mm,
I actually manage RevOps and our SDR team at Revenue IO, so I have multiple teams here. And then we record
mm,
on Fridays at 3 o'clock, which is super important for me because half of my teams are offline because they're not in California. They're done. They're off for the weekend, so I can't be bothered by them. And the ones that are on are finishing up their week and don't really need anything urgent, right? So that's sort of the perfect time for me to record. And I usually prep topic and agenda about an hour before that. Um, and actually, it's sort of like by default, but a lot of times what we talk about, I'll let the team know, hey, we're going to talk about this on Friday morning, and then I'll prep the agenda for it and send it out. Is what I've been working on that week.
yeah.
Like that's very frequently how we pick a topic is because it's hard for me
Mm-hmm.
to get out of, I mean, you're an ops, you get it. I'm in my headspace on one specific major problem that we're trying to solve as a business for us. And in that process, I'm thinking of all the pros and cons and different things. And I hit Friday and I can't switch to a new topic that fast. I mean, that's just not the way my brain works. So why not just use the same topic that I'm trying to solve that problem? Because it's probably a great RevOps topic most of the time, right?
Yeah, and it's just top of mind, and I feel like it's so relevant. Like we do that a lot with our content. It's like, okay, what are some of the common things that we're doing for our clients right now? Let's just talk about those and share our learnings. And because I do like research or backed things. Like I don't like saying, like I like being able to
Yeah,
like test that on a client, see if it's working. Okay, then now we can go to the public with it. Not like, oh, here are my ideas I made up
yeah,
in my head. So and it's likely if you're working on that at that time, a lot of your guests are probably working on the same thing. And I
Exactly.
think even in RevOps, there's like cycles to the type of work you're doing because it's really like, right now it's around like
yeah,
territory planning or quotas and things like that. And, and then it has like some seasonality to it. I think even more so than just marketing ops alone. But so I think that's a great tip for people too when developing like maybe even your own personal brand or LinkedIn content. Like talk
right.
about what
If,
you're doing
if
right
if your
now.
business is having this problem, or in your case, your client's business is having this problem, other people are having this problem too. That's just the reality. Or they are having the problem and they don't know that they're having it. So we always talk about. I like to talk about like how did I identify that this is a problem that we have, right?
Yeah.
Because most people, there's things that are like, that might be a problem. I have no idea how to find out whether it is or isn't. Cool. Let's talk about that. Let's tell you how to go find out if this is a big
Yeah.
problem for you.
Right. One of the things that bugs me the most about thought leadership these days in general, whether it is LinkedIn, podcasts, people talking on stage, is that they're so far removed from the problem itself,
Yeah.
right? So they're just talking high level.
Hmm.
You never actually get real substance out of it. Or maybe this happens in the ABM space, but like there's one guy in particular, he's evangelizing ABM. And when you actually listen to it,
Hmm.
right? I do ABM all the time. I've been doing it for years. I worked at an ABM company, right? You can tell
Yeah.
that's not the way intent data works anymore. Actually, you haven't. It's clear that he hasn't
Yeah.
actually done this in 3-4 years himself. So now he's going and
Hmm.
giving misinformation to people, and then people are going to go out there, try what he does. ABM doesn't work, and then now they're going to hate ABM, right? We don't run
Yeah.
into that because all these problems that we're talking about, we're actually facing right now, and we're actually in the weeds. We've thought through a lot of this stuff, and it actually will be more valuable to the audience.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of responsibility with the type of content we put that
Totally.
out there. I agree with you because sometimes I see things and I'm like, oh, I don't know
Yeah.
about that, you know. But then, so I always tell people like it's less about best practices and it's more about the mindset behind those like
Hmm.
best practices. You know, like it's good to leave with tangible things, but I think really understanding like what is the mindset or what are the things that actually got people to develop those best practices, but also realize that whatever you see out there is not always accurate. I think that is a little bit challenging. But finding podcasts like yourself, you know, practitioner, someone that's why I love seeing like a senior director of RevOps leave a RevOps podcast, not just like a CEO of a, you know, your CEO doing it is going to be a lot
Yeah.
different
Totally.
than
Yeah,
Jordan coming
they're
up
not
with the
going into
content.
Salesforce and building
Yeah.
some custom fields to solve a problem, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just not
No.
happening.
Okay, let's skip through. So, you know, you get your podcast going. You know, really lucky to have had a producer who, you know, sets up a process for you guys. Some people have to stumble through this themselves. But I would say for a platform, we just went on to Riverside and I highly suggest it to people.
Well, but before we leave
So,
that
what
real
about
quick,
like,
let me just
yeah,
point someone to,
yeah,
if they do want to start a podcast, Sweetfish
yeah,
Media does have some awesome,
yeah, see
yeah,
fish.
awesome content about,
Yeah.
it's like their 27-step formula, how to actually launch a podcast. And that's everything from what mic to choose, what platform, how do you actually, how do you get your description, like all that stuff. So if if what we said wasn't valuable enough, I'll point people to that resource.
Brandon gets $1.80 every time he says
Yes.
Sweetfish Media. So
Yeah, exactly.
that's three
They're paying me
dollars
for
and
this.
60 cents for this podcast. So
Yeah, shout out to James
Heck yeah.
Carberry. I remember meeting him for the first time like 5 or 6 years ago when we had like a small dinner in
Yeah.
San Francisco. And now I look at his business and I'm like, wow, it's amazing what
Yeah.
they've
And he's
done.
just a great,
Um,
salt of the earth guy,
yeah, for sure. Um, so I for let's talk about maybe challenges. Like, did you guys hit any like hiccups or challenges or anything as you started, or was it pretty smooth? Like, since you had the support from someone who's already done it before and having had done the sales enablement podcast before?
yeah, I would say one of the things that was, I mean, it gets better as it goes, right? And when you first
hmm
start, you have to just sort of lean into like, let's just record it and see what happens, which is interesting. And one of the
Hmm.
interesting challenges for us, I would say, is that Brandon and I never met until we were 25 episodes deep in real life, right?
Yeah.
And Jonathan and I had met once, I think, and I mean, he's on my team and reports into me, but just based on the timing of the world right now and the fact that we're in California, none of
Yeah.
us knew each other really at all. And which then it's like, hey, let's jump on a podcast, have a good rapport, and record this thing, and just see what happens. There's a lot of trust that goes into that, and we didn't know each other from Adam, and but that's one of the huge, I think, values of this is that now. And we met for the first time just 2 or 3 months ago, and then we met
Yeah.
again. We've now seen each other
Wow.
twice in real life, which is
Wow.
astounding. But it helps you build relationships internally too, which has been really nice. But there were definitely some challenges with like actually recording high quality content and like saying things and not feeling like I don't want to say this because I might sound dumb or they might disagree with me. I think on our third
Mm.
episode we had like a bit of somebody said something and I was like, that's dumb, I don't like that, and then we ended up having like a minor fight on the podcast, which was great content, but
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Exactly.
it was
Oh
yeah.
yeah, I remember you guys sharing that. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's hilarious.
And
Like,
after that, it sort of
yeah,
like clicked for us where we're like, that's totally fine. Like, if that happens, let's lean into it. Like, we should
People love hearing
disagree,
that.
right?
It's real life, right?
Yeah. But
yeah,
it took us a little while to
totally.
sort of like build that rapport and that trust, which I think was a pretty significant challenge at the start for sure. And then there's Brandon can talk more about the challenges of actually launching the thing because I'm just the talent, I'm just the host.
Pretty face that shows up. No, so I think some of the actual internal challenges were getting everyone on board, right? You have a lot of people who have a lot of eyes on you. And when you say, I want to take
Mm,
on a podcast, I want to devote my team's time, some of my budget, right? All these resources to actually launching a podcast, you will have a lot of eyes on you in the beginning. And you do have to have
yeah.
some, you know, um, management expectation, right? And you really have to
Mm-hmm.
plan everything very thoroughly. You have to have very clear communication. So project planning is, a big piece of actually launching a podcast. And when you can do
Yeah.
all that, it makes everything so much easier because it really is just downhill from there. So just nail your first few episodes and then gain that trust of your key stakeholders, which I think we did a pretty good job of. And then now they're just like, do whatever you guys want,
You
you
know,
know?
one of the things we did that
Yeah.
was super smart, but also maybe a bit risky was when we first started, like the three of us, the host and Alec, we were sort of, keen on doing this. We just recorded a couple episodes,
Yeah.
like before we really did anything else,
Mm-hmm.
because we kind of wanted to see how it would go first. And then second,
Yeah.
then we had a
That's true.
really good
Yeah.
pilot episode to submit out to key stakeholders to get approval. Like, hey, we want to do this podcast. Also, here's the pilot. Go listen to it. Because
Yep.
it avoids the objections of like, oh yeah, we should do that podcast, but maybe so and so should host, or maybe so and so should do this. Like, no, we've already recorded this. Look how good it is, right? Let's just get that out of there. Give us your feedback on the episode, and skip all the rest of that bullshit. And then let's keep moving forward. That was really
Yeah.
helpful, I think, in us getting this like through.
That's a great idea. Yeah, we did that. We did that at CS2. Unfortunately, I was like 10 months pregnant when we
wow.
did them, but like we filmed like three or four or something. I was like, we strategically placed like a laptop in front of my stomach because we knew it would be posting after I delivered. But like, and looking back on them now, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have come light years from
Yeah.
that. But,
Yeah.
we're almost at like 100 episodes.
That's
So it's
awesome.
like
Yeah.
you do get into like a
Yeah.
rhythm, you get into, I will say for process though, like you said, project planning, even with our production team, like I think thinking through all the tasks, making it really
hmm
repeatable. I will say for people, it's really useful. We use our internal tool, ClickUp, but like any tool, like something you can use for actually planning out where all the steps for this and then repeating it, making sure people are hitting their deadlines,
By the
I
way,
would think is really
100
good. But what,
episodes.
yeah.
Congrats.
Yeah.
I don't
Well
think people
done.
realize how much work
Thanks.
100 episodes is as a
Yeah.
milestone. So that's awesome. Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, but the funny thing, one thing that so I always have I say this story, but like I worked at like a startup before CS2 about like 7 years ago. And I was like, we should do a podcast. Like we're trying to get a hold of like, enterprise leaders and they have commutes and they're not going to go to our webinars. Like, let's do a podcast. And at the time, the CEO shut it down because he's like, no one listens to podcasts. Like podcasts, no one does that, And I always laugh because like if we had created the podcast, who knows? Like they could have the top like security podcasts or
Yeah.
whatever, like something that enterprise people actually listen to. But when you said, okay, coming with a pilot, I love that idea, having a plan and like really selling that to your leadership team, I think is super important. Like, don't just say, oh, we should do a podcast for
Yeah.
podcast's sake. Like, know your why, like you talked about, have a plan, film
Yeah.
one. I think that's all really good advice. Because a lot of people say, how do I get this off the ground? Or how do I convince my leadership that we should
Totally.
do one?
Right.
And
You have to build a business case for it,
Yeah.
right? It was not just us
Yeah.
going, we have this great idea. We want to do a podcast. Can
Yeah.
we? Right? It's
Yeah.
like, here's how this is actually going to affect all the different pieces of the business. And, these days,
Mhm.
I really do think brand and demand, the lines are blurring between the two, right? And if you can get both going, then they just feed off of each other. So that's why the
Mhm.
podcast and our activity on LinkedIn actually helps more than just getting our name out there, promoting revenue operations as a category. It's actually helping drive demand at the same time.
Totally. It's also
Yeah,
the pilot
for
was
sure.
partially for me because before we went to go do all this, I actually wanted to make sure we were capable of
Yeah.
doing a good podcast.
Yeah.
And because in my mind, it was like, if we go to the CEO and the CMO and we ask for this and they commit to it and we get it all done and then we record it and it's just a dumpster fire, like, oh my God, that's going to suck, right? I just wanted to prove prove to us that, hey, this is a good idea. We can actually do this, then go get it. Because otherwise the inverse just doesn't make sense.
Totally. So on that kind of note, but this comes down to like leadership and how do you like kind of what are your KPIs that you are tracking right now, or how do you show the, I wouldn't even say effectiveness, but how do you show how you're creating that engagement or demand back to leadership? Because obviously they're supporting you guys, they're putting budget toward that. So are there any kind of key KPIs that you look at to really show your success?
Yeah, so we do look at things like how many listens do we get per episode. We do pay attention on
Mm-hmm.
LinkedIn about how many followers we built a company page for the RevOps podcast, and that was just one of the things that helped us launch to really help get our name out there in the beginning. But we do look at that, and then after we post every episode, we do post it on LinkedIn, and we're looking at those post engagements. But those are real top of funnel metrics. But we know that if these things improve, then there will be domino effects, right? Again, you're not going to be able to directly
Totally.
attribute any close one revenue to a podcast, but we've been around
Yeah.
marketing and sales long enough where
We actually
oh,
can.
we
There's
can,
a
we
thing
actually
that we're
can.
doing that we can attribute to a little bit, which it's more like influenced revenue versus
Yeah,
clearly generated. But one of the things we do, and this was, I mean, it's actually great, is we sell at Revenue.io, we sell to ops leaders, RevOps leaders, right? And so very frequently
Mm,
we offer, like, hey, we'd love to get your head of RevOps on the podcast during the deal cycle,
right,
right? Because they're
exactly.
first, it's a great
yeah.
guest. A lot of the businesses we work with are wonderful businesses, and so it's somebody we would want to have on either way. But what a great way to influence a deal across the finish line to have that person come on our podcast and
Yeah.
build a relationship with us, right? Because this is networking at the end of the
Hmm.
day. Like Chrissy, we're networking right
Totally.
now, and I would
Yeah.
some attribution to that for sure.
Totally. Or implied attribution, I think, is one thing Brandon is kind of talking about as well, is like you can start to see like that domino effect, like getting, more visitors to your website, but then also is your cost of
Yeah,
acquisition going down? Are you
Yep.
seeing more organic,
Right, it's direct
visitors
traffic,
and so
you know?
forth? Yeah. And so I like that. And then also definitely like I think one key thing about a podcast, I think Sweetfish maybe calls this like the Trojan
Right.
horse, but like actually, yeah, and taking that like person who's maybe your buyer and
yeah,
inviting them to your podcast because you're people are people, like you said, like you feed a little bit
yeah.
into their ego a bit, like, oh, come on our podcast, but still like it's still interesting. You understand also their pain points on that. It's almost like you're doing a cold call or like
Totally.
qualification call with them, but in something that they're really
Totally.
willing to
I
do.
actually did that in my first podcast, and I completely stumbled upon it. Didn't mean to. We had a bunch of guests on. We had great conversations, and then afterwards, they were like, I like you. I kind of want to learn more about what you guys do. Explained it to them. They're like, maybe we
Yeah.
need that. Huh? Interesting. And we actually closed a few deals
Hmm.
sourced from them being a podcast. So it was completely by accident, but I think that's a great strategy. And you're right, Sweetfish Media it does really promote that as a strategy.
The other, and sort of tangentially to the, like, I like you guys, standpoint of the podcast. One of the things I look at very closely, because I think it's the hardest thing to do right now in a business, is the podcast has helped us in recruiting as a business and hiring.
Hmm. Yep.
And
Totally.
it's had like very
Totally.
impactful. We've had 4 hires over the past 4 months that have said, one of the reasons I chose you guys over everybody else, I wanted to work with these people, right? And you're putting your culture
Yes.
out in the world. You're showing people, hey, we're fun, we're having a good time, like, we're building something great together, come join us. And that, man, if we can get one hire a year, it's worth the time investment, because hiring is tough right now. It's
Yeah.
so hard, and
Yes.
so there's a huge
And
impact.
yeah, totally. And actually, people ask us, "Oh, are you doing the podcast for new business?" It's like, well, luckily we have more business that we can take on. But
Nice.
the great thing for us is actually
Yeah,
like
Hmm.
hiring. One, the people like understand who we are and what we're doing. But I've actually had some people where I'll reach out and say, like, "Oh, are you interested in maybe being a consultant? Well, I'm actually really a big fan of you. Why don't you come on the podcast?"
Hmm.
And there's been like actually most recently we had one of them actually go, okay, maybe I do
yeah,
want to interview with
yeah.
you guys. And I'm like, yes, like that is, that's 100%. That's like what I want. And this is full transparency for
Yeah.
everyone listening. But it's not a tactic though. It's more like I'm interested in them too. Like I want to share their ideas, get to know them, but it's just an added
Is this an
benefit,
interview
for sure.
Are you trying to get us to come work there?
Yeah,
We did
yeah,
have
you get
we had a
it.
guest, I think, actively try to poach me on a podcast episode.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's a bit bold, I feel.
The one other
Okay,
benefit, the
yeah.
last one I'll say, is we've actually built co-marketing relationships
Yeah.
with companies,
Yeah.
right? We had, again, maybe slightly cheating, John Miller on the podcast, of Marketo fame.
Mm-hmm.
I say slightly
Yeah.
cheating because he hired me as the first hire over at Engagio, so easy to get him on the podcast. But we've had other people where we've actually done content with them, or I've done a webinar with them, and it's a great way to just, again, get in the door, prove that you would be a great partner, that you have value to add to the community. And it's like when you approach them after and say, hey, do you want to do this webinar, or do you want to collaborate on this ebook? They're going to say, yeah, you were great to work with before on the podcast. Sure, why not? I'd be willing to do that.
Yeah, for sure. That's our one thing we have in common. We both worked for
There
John
you
Miller.
go. I didn't know that.
The OG content
That's
creator. Right. I worked in marketing ops at Marketo way back in the day. So, okay, one final question, because I know we only have a few minutes left, but I want to talk about promotion, because yes, you could just have your podcast, but how do you promote the thing? And like, how do you share that responsibility? Because I know, Jordan, you share on LinkedIn, I see your videos come up, but what's kind of like your plan for promotion? What are the channels that you use and what's most effective? Maybe we'll start with Jordan first and then go to Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I do. LinkedIn is for me like the biggest thing, right? And building your LinkedIn following. Like if you think, hey, I might start a podcast in 2 years or a year, start building your LinkedIn following now, because it's one of the biggest ways to promote it. By the way, just add value, whatever. Like it's just important. Yeah. We had a pretty big promotional plan. Like we went around like a pretty big launch strategy with our podcast in general. And so we launched 5 episodes on the same day, just because we wanted to give people, like, hey, not just a 30-minute teaser, but here's full, like, binge this, right? We did that Netflix approach, like binge that first season right away.
Yeah.
Sort of drop.
I remember you guys did that, and I thought, wow, that's such a smart idea. I love
because
that.
one of the things that helps you with promotions is like the more downloads you have in that first day, it raises your exposure, and so the more episodes you have, the more downloads you get, which is an interesting thing. Also kind of rough, because recording 5 episodes and then dumping them all on one day really sucks for the old like backfill of upcoming episodes. But it's worth doing. We did, because we're, it's the RevOps podcast by Revenue.io. We did email campaigns out to our base here, our email engaged base, our marketing nurture base at the company. And then we had, internal, reviews where we were reaching out to people like, hey, please listen to this. We also, had a pretty big campaign around emailing friends and family. Hey, go listen to this, like get it out. We had like 5 spreadsheets of like things that people had to go do, like me and you specifically on launch day.
Spreadsheets.
Yeah. Asana and spreadsheets around like the different components of that campaign. But I think the 2 biggest were the email marketing, and then the social engagement would be our top things. The trick is launching like the LinkedIn page and the podcast and all those things on the same day, so that nobody gets a sneak peek or sees anything in advance. So that way it actually can be like a proper announcement, and then coordinating efforts to get, our CEO was posting about it, our CMO was posting about it. We had other people at other companies that were, partnerships posting about it. All that has to happen at a synchronized time on the launch day.
Within a few days.
And I sound like I'm taking credit for this. I basically was the guy that was like, write my post and I'll put it up on launch day. Brandon and Alec really took care of the rest of it. I also, by the way, I wrote my own post. Thank you. But everything else.
I do appreciate that from Jordan. He's good about writing his own posts.
I actually
for other
hate
people.
when people write them for me. So
thank you.
But yeah, I mean, Brandon can talk more about all of that. But it was a very complex launch strategy, and then the ongoing promotion is mostly on social.
Yeah, and some of the other things that we did too, like I mentioned, we created a company page for the RevOps podcast, and then added ourselves as working there as hosts. So that shows up in all of our contacts feeds. Jordan started a new job as the host of the RevOps podcast. Now everyone will go check that out, right? We did blog posts around the top 7 sales podcasts to listen to. Of course, we're going to put our own in there, right? We did
all 5 episodes, baby. Get it in there.
all 5 of those. Go exactly. And even created slide shares where it's already got a few thousand views on the slide share itself. Like, even though people who knew that SlideShare was still a thing, but you get 100 here, 100 there, and before you know it, it really added up. I think our goal was to hit like 1,000 downloads in the first 30 days. We blew that out of the water, or just like a week or something before we got our first 1,000 downloads. And just big coordinated effort. A lot of little things really added up.
Yeah, that's amazing. First of all, congratulations to you guys. But I think one thing to take away from that is just like really maximizing on all of your different channels. And a lot of that are not paid channels, right? Like you said, it's like, taking advantage of the audiences you already have, your personal brand, followers, tapping into some like micro influencers, like other people who are, active on LinkedIn. And I think, like you said, all those things together, because one thing I think is successful for promotion is just someone seeing it in multiple places, right? You can't just get someone's attention through one thing. It needs to be like all over the place, and that's why I love like LinkedIn takeovers and things like that.
Surround sound.
Figure out how to make, not just entertain your base, but make them feel like they're a part of the conversation. That for us has been a huge piece of promotion. We do a segment at the end of every episode called This Week on LinkedIn. And what we do is we solicit, like, people send me, I get 10 or 15 questions a week from people saying, hey, can you help me with this? Can you help me with this? And we actually ask those questions on the podcast and then answer them for that person. So they're actually,
nice,
you're not just LinkedIn messaging me. And I do send them a response. And then I say, hey, by the way, we used your question here. Like, I read it. I said your name, like, blah, 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 right? And we've gotten so many of those questions now because people are so engaged with this content that we now do full episodes where we do nothing but answer LinkedIn questions because we need to get to all of them because it's very exciting, right? But the idea there is this isn't me just preaching at you. This is a conversation, and everybody's a part of this conversation. It's not just us, right? And that's super important for creating, back to, Chrissy, what you said, like the micro influencers, right? If I answer your question that you send me, you're much more likely to post about that and tag us in it, which is wonderful for us. So, yeah.
But I think that goes all the way back to what we talked about in the beginning, is just adding value to the audience, right?
Yeah.
Engaging with other people in the RevOps community, and really giving back. Because for us, it goes back to the community, right? It's not about Jordan. It's not about me. Sorry, Jordan. It's not about you. It's not even about it's not even about revenue.io. But the more that we can do to actually support other RevOps professionals, the more we're all just going to be successful, right? So it's the rising tide lifts all boats, mentality.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great thing to end on. So I feel like I could have kept going, but we're definitely kind of running out of time here. But the last thing, what's next for the RevOps podcast?
301 series. So we did the 101 series, which is like, what are things? How do you do them? How do you do marketing attribution? How do you
just definition?
Right, definitions. Like, this is what this is.
Yeah.
These are the things. 201 series is really metrics driven. So going back to those things, how to identify if there's a problem, like diagnostic metrics that you can use to figure out where problems are in your business. 301 series is going to be more case studies and examples. And so bringing on more guests and like, hey, here's how they diagnosed this problem. Here's the success story of how they fixed it moving forward. So that way people can take what they've learned in the first 101s and 201s and actually implement it the same way people have in real world scenarios. So which doesn't sound as exciting as it's going to be. I promise. It's gonna be awesome. Yeah.
No, it sounds
Brandon doesn't know this, by the way. I totally I make up the I do this on the back end, and then I'm like, hey, by the way, we're starting the 301 series today, and they're like, cool, what is that? I got it all taken care of.
Yeah.
That's so funny. Well, it was a blast having you guys on today. So thank you so much for joining today. So if you guys want to find the RevOps podcast, you can find it on all of
Yeah.
pretty much the normal podcast players, and or you could check out revenue.io. And we will be linking to Jordan and Brandon's LinkedIn profiles in the description. So if you want, go follow them. They share a lot of great content. I follow both of them, and learn some best practices. My least favorite word I said, but you guys do have a lot of great thought leadership out there, and so highly suggest following them, and you'll get some tidbits from the podcast just following them. So yeah, thanks so much for joining. Hopefully this has inspired some of you all to feel like you can support and enable your team to maybe build a podcast or maybe start your own. Who
That's right.
knows?
Yeah.
The more the merrier. But yeah, if you enjoyed this episode of Forward Thinking, feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues, and we'll see you
Thanks,
next
Chrissy.
time.
This was a lot of fun.
Have a
Thanks
good
for having
one.
us, Chrissy.